How about the revolution in Kiev and Independence Square? We see it, don't we? We see all that going on. What two countries don't you have access to in terms of what they're doing vis-a-vis themselves, their neighbors, the United States, and their own political system? Iraq, and even more importantly, Iran. Somebody asked me, is Rouhani a moderate? I said, I can believe he's a moderate when he ceases the execution of political opponents and he admits the global press, journalists on a day-to-day basis, not on an ad hoc basis, come in and do a favorable interview, like a lot of people rush to do it, but they don't really ever get a full report. And so what are we dealing with now? We're dealing with an Iraqi government, and I would say Maliki is a puppet and Rouhani and the mullahs are pulling the strings. I just kind of ask rhetorically, but I'm absolutely in wonderment and awe that anybody in this building or anybody in this town thinks they're going to negotiate a meaningful nuclear accord with the Iranian government. The same Iranian government that supports Hamas, Hezbollah, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, that brought chaos to southern Lebanon. The same Iran that sends money, weapons, and troops to support Syria. Their murderous, inhumane, evil Assad. And somehow, even though the Syrian talks have fallen through, somehow we are reluctant. We are reluctant to welcome several hundred of these men and women to the United States as political refugees because we are somehow concerned it may disrupt the ongoing conversation and negotiation with the Iranian regime. I dare say, folks, you know, the Constitution says the only state allowed to have 2 senators. I'll be the 3rd constitutionally elected senator in Pennsylvania before that happens. It's not going to happen. And I want to go back to the point I made at the very get-go. On multiple occasions, the United States government, through its designated, elected, and appointed officials, have made commitments to the men and women in Ashraf, have made commitments to the men and women who are fortunately, their voices in this country and, frankly, around the world, and not a single commitment has been met. I need to read you a couple of things before I conclude my remarks, and I think it's very important. I hope you get a chance to read the Wall Street Journal article today. It's well done, and frankly, it's from the perspective of a couple of men who spent several years, General Phillips, with the men and women at Ashraf. But I think there are a couple of things that you should know, and I don't take Farsi, so I relied on somebody else's interpretation to bring this to my attention, but there have been a couple of remarks made by some of the Iranian leaders that I think you ought to be aware of. On March 2nd, Iraq's Justice Minister, during his trip to Tehran, quote, according to an agreement signed between Iran and Iraq on the swap of prisoners, Iran can ask for the extradition of MEK members, and then Iraq will hand them over to Iran. Now, remember, these are the people we were going to protect and secure, and we're going to get you out of Ashraf, out of harm's way, and we're going to take you to liberty, and then we're going to resettle you. On March 10th, Iranian Justice Minister called for the extradition of the members of the MEK to Iran, and I quote, the terrorist MEK members should be handed over to Iran to put on trial for their crimes against the Iranian nation. Close quote, the Iranian Justice Minister told reporters in Tehran. They must stand for trial for, quote, helping our enemies, close quote. I think that's an implicit reference to the MEK's nuclear revelations since 2002, exposing for the benefit of the United States and the Western world the 2 nuclear sites at Natanz in Iraq. And obviously, it triggered the IAEA inspections. And we promised to provide for their safety and security. Some of us take this very personal. Very personal. Ladies and gentlemen, It's one thing for a policy decision to be made, and I don't want to disengage from the rest of the world. It's another thing to be disrespected around the world. And if this administration chooses by whatever course, and I'm not to disengage and pull back from the rest of the world, that's the administration's decision, and we'll let the men and women in this chamber and the other chamber debate and discuss that all day long, and for the next couple of years, they probably will. It's another thing to be disrespected around the world. And what's the quickest way to be disrespected? The quickest way for you to disrespect somebody else is for somebody to give you their word and go back on your word. I dare say, is there anything more important to you in your relationship with individuals, people you care about, people you know, business, personally, socially, if they say they're going to do something and they fail to do it, or if they're disingenuous, don't keep their promise? I think that's the quickest avenue to disrespect and repudiation down the road. So if we want to be disengaged, that's a foreign policy decision, but disrespect is another thing. And I dare say, the rest of the world knows the promises we made to these 3,400 at one time, men and women in Ashraf in 2002 when we disarmed them. The rest of the world knows we promised them protection under the Fourth Geneva Convention. The rest of the world knows that we told Maliki, you've got to provide the safety and security. I'm hoping as much of the world knows is that they convinced several Americans to use their credibility and visibility to convince them to move liberty. The rest of the world knows that they're living in a concentration camp. And the rest of the world knows that even Secretary of State Clinton promised that they'd be safe and secure and they would expedite resettlement. And the rest of the world knows, as of today, as of March 12th, 2014, the United States of America has failed miserably to keep its word. And if you don't keep its word to political refugees who have surrendered their means of self-defense to you, how much credibility do you have in the broader world community on other issues? Oh, I know you don't know these 3,000 people, and it may just be a blip on the screen compared to the number of people getting assassinated and murdered and tortured and killed in Syria and elsewhere around the world, but none of those people did the United States government pledge to provide safety and security. So to the men and women who were on respective staffs, we share this insight, this perspective with you. If you have an opportunity to engage your congressman or senator about this critical issue, at the end of the day, the fate of these individuals rests in the hands not of Maliki, but in our hands. So I think maybe we ought to just discontinue aid for a while, put a little pressure on him. I think we're going to negotiate with the Iranians. We ought to send them a signal that once we make a commitment, we keep it. Let's get them out of there. Let's open the doors to a couple hundred of them here because, frankly, the rest of the world is waiting for the United States to admit them as political refugees. We've had people in Scandinavian countries, have been all over Europe, they've been over Eastern Europe. They're saying, well, we're interested in taking them as political refugees, but when is America going to take them? We don't need to take all 3,000. Just bring a couple hundred in here and the doors will open elsewhere. So at the end of the day, I know not everybody in here is working for a member of the House or the Senate, but if you know one, they got phone numbers, they got chiefs of staff, and I encourage you to simply ask them to do the right thing. Make sure that America keeps its word. It's not a matter about being disengaged, it's about being disrespected. And as long as we fail to keep our word, there's no reason in the world why anybody should ever could ever rely on American promise again. Thank you very much.